Well, it's really nice to be here, and I'm very happy you asked me to get involved here tonight. Micheál, it's a great idea. Really like what you're doing down in Cork. I certainly think that there's room for it here in Limerick. Where do I start? My God, I mean, I could speak for 5 minutes or 2 hours, so we'll see. I'll try not to be on either. I mean, I've been on a journey myself, a personal journey. I started off as a doctor, was a GP for 10 years, really believed everything I'd been taught, until I got out and started meeting a lot of real people, patients as they're called. And I began to realise that particularly in mental health, what I was taught was kind of like one box, but the people coming in my door weren't fitting into that box. And this really alarmed me, and I was absolutely unprepared really to work in mental health. And if I was unprepared, then so were my colleagues. But I decided, after much thought and a lot of turmoil really, that I just had to pursue this. I had to go on a journey, and one question begot another question and led to another and then another and another, and eventually I decided I chose to leave being a GP and did an MA in psychotherapy, simply to enhance my understanding, I think, of this whole emotional and mental world that we live in. And again, one thing led to another, and I wrote some books, and for the last 15 years I've been providing a recovery-oriented mental health service. And I really like the idea of your title tonight about emotional maturity, you know, and I often talk about a new era in mental health. These things are so necessary. And as I was thinking about emotional maturity, you know, what are the characteristics of maturity? Well, one of them is, you know, in an adult way, looking at life and looking at the things maybe we prefer not to look at. And the whole area of emotionality comes into this, and the speaker, Brady, was it? Sorry? Yeah. Touched on this and you know, what we do with our pain, and she's so right. And I think we really have to wake up in our society, and it's not just here, it's in every Western society. From a very young age, we were cultured, and so are children now, to put away some of their feelings, and it's a cultural thing. I see it in boys, I see it in teenagers, and when I talk about a new era in mental health, like I've been a doctor for 30 years, more than 30 years, I know the medical system inside out, and I can see the flaws are so fundamental in that approach, and the public do not realise how fundamental they are. So one area that needs to be looked at is that, the flaws within the current system. But then there's a whole other area, what else do we need to do? And without doubt, the whole area of emotionality and psychology and emotional and psychological maturity, I'd probably call it, really needs to be core. And as I have been listening very, very carefully to people in distress, people with various diagnoses, certain themes keep emerging. And they're not things like chemical abnormalities. There are so many myths in mental health, and that is one of them. There is no evidence whatsoever of any chemical imbalance, and that's all I'm going to say about it. It is a myth that has been promoted to sell a particular approach, and it's taken over. And it was touched on in one of the speakers earlier on about serotonin. Nonsense. It's never been established at all in any human being ever. You can't even measure brain serotonin. So that's one side of it, but the other side is very important too, and I think that's probably one area where we fall down in society. You know, it's easy to say this needs to change, but what are we going to put in its place? And it struck me that there are certain recurring themes that really have to be, they're always there. They're always there. Wounding. We human beings get wounded easily. We get wounded far more than we might realise. We get wounded far more than the mental health system recognises. What does wounding cause? Pain. So the first thing is wounding, actually shock, probably second. Shock, pain and distress. And these are all features of the people who attend mental health services. Wounding, shock, distress in many forms. Then what do we do? And she kind of touched on it in the talk. What do we do with all of these things? If we're experiencing an awful lot of hurt and wounding, we try to protect ourselves. We create defense mechanisms. And an awful lot of the experiences that fall into the area of mental health are defense mechanisms. And they're people's best solution as they see it. And it needs to be seen as that. A concept that I think is hugely important. I think it was Carl Rogers came up with it first. accurate empathy, which basically means seeking to understand deeply what that other person, what the person sitting across from you is going through. And I don't see enough of that in the mental health service. That is absolutely vital. So, defense mechanisms, choices and choice making. That is part of how we live. We are choice makers all the time. And choice making and decision making has a role to play. And that needs to be part of it. And the final bit, which is tied in with the others, is trauma. We human beings get traumatized very easily. And it's completely underplayed in society. There are lots of reasons for that. So they're the key things, really, as I see it. And they would be the cornerstones of what I would see as a new era in mental health. And linked in with that is emotional maturity. And with maturity, I think, with adult maturity, hopefully, goes freedom, and freedom of expression, for example. And where there is immaturity, there is censorship. And there's an awful lot of censorship in the world we live in right now. There's a lot of don'ts, don't cry, don't be weak, don't be vulnerable, etc. And we pick these up. But where does that leave somebody who experiences a lot of these things? Where do they go? How do they speak? Say somebody who feels very deeply suicidal, for example. Where do they go? How many people can hear, I feel suicidal? How many people can stay with that and be with that person and take that conversation through to some form of resolution? At least the person will have expressed what's going on for them. The word express literally means to bring out of. And if a person gets a chance to bring out of them what they're experiencing and share with another human being, it's connected with the connectedness that we talked about earlier on, then a problem shared can be a problem halved. Not always, but at least something has moved. Whereas, generally speaking, when somebody feels suicidal, there's not too many places or people they can go to. I mean, I work now, I don't call myself a psychotherapist, I provide a mental health service because I'm a range of different things. But the whole area of counselling and psychotherapy, for example, if there was emotional maturity in our society, there'd be far less need for counselling and psychotherapy. Because I've heard so many people have said to me over the years, this is the only place I can say these things. Now that is censorship, and that is immaturity. And I think that emotional and psychological maturity involves respect for all our experiences. She touched on it there, and she's so right. We cannot block some feelings without blocking the others. And so many of the features of psychiatric diagnoses actually are about numbness and blocking. One of the things she touched on in terms of the unworthiness, and I suppose one of the things I've tried to do is try to figure things out, and spent years trying to, okay, so what might that mean? And the whole area, for example, of I'm not worthy, I go a little further than what she said. I've worked with a lot of people for whom I am not worthy is a defense mechanism. How could it be a defense mechanism? If I believe I'm not worthy, I won't take risks. And it's the risks that scare me. It's the risks that terrify me. I'm feeling so vulnerable that I'm terrified that taking a risk could result in humiliation or the final breaking of my spirit. So by becoming convinced that I'm unworthy, well, I give myself a kind of logical reason for not doing the thing that actually terrifies me. And so many of the experiences that end up being part of a psychiatric diagnosis are, as I said, wounding, distress, shock, defense mechanisms. It's a different language, and it's the language of emotionality and psychology. I remember, I was just thinking of it there, one of my wake-up moments about 10 years ago, I was speaking in Dublin after my book was published, and it was a 4-hour talk. And I was tired after it, had gone very well, and somebody asked me at the end of it, the organiser actually asked me, would I mind driving somebody home to Limerick? And my first reaction was, yeah, sure, of course. And then I moved on to talk to somebody else, and I got this surge of anger. It just nearly knocked me over. It was like whoosh, and I had to kind of think, whoa, what is this? And I literally had to just take a few steps back, and I realised that what had happened was I had answered without checking with myself. I needed space and time. I'd been talking for 4 hours, and I actually was looking forward to that trip home on my own. and now I was going to be sitting with somebody else. Nothing to do with the other person. I just needed space for me. So my anger came up as a kind of a little light bulb to me to pay more attention to me. And that was such a wake up for me. And then, so then I actually thought, okay, what am I going to do here? So I went back to the organizer and said, look, I'm really sorry, but I really need this time on my own. And the organizer said, it's no problem, she's a ticket for the train anyway. She was just interested in having a chat, which is very reasonable. For me, the really interesting thing was, as soon as I said that, my anger went down as quickly as it came up. And I just went, whoa. And it just showed me that we have wisdom in here. Like, that was sheer wisdom that I didn't know I had. It's kind of like we operate in two levels. You know, we operate at a cognitive level, our thoughts, our feelings that we're aware of, our sensations. But there's something else down here. And I often think of it in terms of an iceberg. You know, an iceberg, you've got whatever it is, 30% or whatever above the surface. But the really important part, the part that sinks ships, is beneath the surface. And in the work I can see that all the time. And if we just focus on the surface stuff, there are so many loose ends all the time. Things don't add up. Things don't make sense. And unfortunately, our mental health service does that. It just focuses on the surface. So if a person's story doesn't make sense to the person on the other side of the desk, then it's wrong in some way. But I've learned that if you actually go deeper and you take into account the person's story and their experiences and how they process the world, their inner world, I suppose, then you can really make sense of experience. So I suppose, you know, one of the most important things I would say to you is every experience we have, every feeling, every thought, there's a purpose to it. I don't like the idea of rejecting any feeling. It has a purpose, whether it's anger, hurt, sorrow. In our society, in terms of emotional maturity, I think it's very important that we learn as a society how important it is to just express how we are. And for us to be prepared to hear how other people are. And I think one mistake we often make, we think we have to fix things for people. You know, somebody says, I'm really feeling quite down today, or whatever it might be. We often feel a pressure to come in then and make them feel better. That's not what they need at all. They just need to be heard. And in the hearing of how they are, a change takes place inside. And I would love if as a society we could get how significant, how important, how transformative it is to listen carefully. And to listen, I suppose, active listening, without feeling the need to come in there and make it all better. That's not our role. Beyond that, I'm not sure what to say. I really like the idea of emotional and psychological maturity. I think it's so important. I suppose one thing I would also say, I find myself in a position where I see, as I said, major problems within the whole mental health system that I think are not seen commonly. And I think we have to be careful. Another sign of maturity is what we do with power and how we approach power. And we've seen in our society, and we've seen it in other countries, how dangerous it can be to give groups authority and power. We've seen it in this country in relation to the church, in relation to the banks, in relation to a whole series of other things. And I think we need to examine, not just here, but in other countries as well, the authority and power we give to the providers of the mental health services. Yeah. I don't feel they understand people sufficiently. I don't think that what they're doing is fit for purpose at all. But the public don't question that enough. So another sign of emotional and psychological maturity is equality, which means you question and you don't take people's word for an answer as gospel. So if somebody tells you you have a chemical imbalance, you ask, how do you know that? You haven't done a test, for example. Or if somebody says you have a brain disorder, how do you know that? I haven't had a scan. This is the kind of equalizing that needs to happen so that we can, I suppose, find ourselves in that process. Because whenever we put any group or any person above us, we're literally putting ourselves down. Maturity is about coming fully into who we are, individually and as a group. I think that's probably all I would say. Good
We're just going to invite like a discussion, an open discussion. Like, was there any comments or questions for Terry or anything like that, or just anything you want to share in regard to this? You're more than welcome.
Sure. Well, we are diagnosing kids
Yes.
from a young age with the likes of ADHD, stuff like that. Where do you stand on that side of things, and does ADHD even exist?
Right. I suppose I generally stick to what I have personal experience in, and I don't work with young kids, right?
Yeah.
But to go something parallel to it, on Friday there was an article in the British Independent newspaper where the statistics showed that the prescribing of antidepressants in children has gone up by 30% in the past 10 years.
So the most imminence they'd be talking about.
I know that. I'll come to that in a second. I'm just talking about the whole idea of prescribing for children. Even though those drugs are not actually licensed for children, apart from one of them. And to me, that shows. I'll come back to your question in a second. But to me, what that reveals is the limited thinking, the one-dimensional approach of the medical profession. I really think we need a serious examination of really how much doctors actually know, and how applicable that is, and what's missing that they're not providing. People often, I know, I will answer. People often think that doctors don't pay attention, for example, to emotionality, because in the context of things, it's not quite as important as what they do, as the brain stuff. But what I've seen over the years is that they don't actually do any brain stuff. There are no tests done. It's mythical, really. So it's the belief system, it's the whole ethos. We really have to look at this very seriously in terms of ADHD and stuff. As I said, I don't work with kids, but I mean, if you look at what's happened, I'm not sure what the statistics are here, but in America I think 6 to 7 million children are on Ritalin and other drugs, and there's a very serious ethical question, I think, about putting children on stimulants, amphetamine related drugs. I mean, that just rings something really wrong about that. Now, I'm not saying medication has no role. Of course it does. It kind of does a bit what she was saying. It numbs pain, and there are times when numbing pain helps. Ivor Brown has made a psychiatrist in Dublin. You may have heard of him, well-known psychiatrist. I read an article he wrote one day, and he was interviewed, and he made I thought, a very clever statement about medication. He said, medication is helpful to bring people down, or as in to ground people to a point where they can be worked, where you can work with that. And that to me is a really good definition of the role of medication. So I personally think long-term use of medication without trying to address the other stuff is really risky. Tony Humphreys, the Cork psychologist from Cork, very good guy. At a course I did once, and I completely agree with what he was saying. He was saying there's actually no such thing as attention deficit, because attention's always on something, but it might be on what people want it to be on.
Or boredom.
Yes, or boredom. There's certainly something going on, but whether there's so many psychosocial interventions that could be done now, and I think if we had more focus on the psychosocial and emotional aspects of life, we would come up with a lot more.